I actually
Excellent.
thought that you were when I came in, so
No, I never record before asking people, but I am now. We're recording here with Praxius. How you doing, Praxius?
I'm doing good. I appreciate you having me on. It's an honor.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on. You have an article called Defining the Right. Can you explain to
Mhm.
people what is the right? What is the left? How do you define that?
So in the article, it's really within the first it's within the second paragraph actually that the true thesis is presented. So I would say that the right has had a history of obscurity and being fractured into these different, domains of what it means to be a rightist. Whereas the left has had a almost unilateral definition for the entirety of its duration, which is equality. For me, I think that such a unilateral definition is possible to present for the right as well, um, that unifies all of these different fractured definitions that we see pop up. And that would be of ontological propriety. And what that really means is that the right is oriented towards what someone would consider or what a metaphysician would consider to be the proper way of being for all human types. So you have the notion of, for example, the caste system. You would say that the proper way for a person who is disposed to being a priest would be would be to actualize a vocation as a priest, for example. I think it's a lot more nuanced than just four castes. Obviously, you have different. I mean, people are differentiated on many different bases, right? They have spiritual dispositions, they have physical dispositions, biological, mental dispositions, and so forth. And not all of these can be, um, quantified or even qualified by any metric. They're just a lot of these. There's a gray area, so to speak. But I think what the right truly tries to do is identify these things and then, um, I guess, format society in a way where people are able to actualize these dispositions in the best way possible. And I think that this is the best way to positively define the right, right? The right is not like this anti, people define it as anti-popular or anti-egalitarianism or anti this or anti that. I think the right is pro ontological propriety, but most people on the right lack the um, erudition or even the introspection to be able to articulate that correctly, I think.
Okay, so let me try to define propriety and you're going to correct my definition. Propriety, ontological propriety, is a recognition of the proper role or function of a thing and trying to fulfill that proper role or function. Is that how did I do?
Yes, yeah, actually, that's precisely correct.
Okay, so my issue with everything you've just laid out regarding ontological propriety and saying that each person in a society could be a priest, a warrior, a merchant, they have different dispositions. And so, like each person, there's like an ideal job for them. Like that person might be a carpenter, they might be a teacher, they might be a lawyer, they might be a nurse. But there's an ideal job. And then there's an ideal set of rituals, there's an ideal architecture, there's an ideal environment that we can construct that will fit this person's construction as well as possible, so that like they're kind of maximizing their potential, and we're eliminating the friction. Like obviously if you take a person and you subject them to torture, then that environmental influence on the person is destructive. It leads to dysfunction, and they're not able to fulfill their properties. Um, and so my issue with this is that I feel it's too individualistic. If you say that each person in society should fulfill their own individual function, um, I think that uh, it's excluding the possibility that people can be malformed in their properties, so that you could have a majority of people who, in trying to construct a social order that would best fit their needs, you would actually be you would be committing a sin against the truly functional people of that society. Um, so I would give the example of like abortion would be that people can say, well, abortion causes harm to people who get abortions. It is not, therefore, it's not good for them. We should restrict this abortion so that people don't encounter this harm. And my argument would be that if you protect those individuals from themselves, from that abortion, then the externality of that is you have a billion more children, and that's not good for humanity as a whole. So, whereas you're, and again, you can
May I
correct me
interject?
here.
Could I interject?
Yes, go ahead.
All right. So I actually would agree with you in that, and I think that part of part of the right wing semantics is obscured in obscured by modern rightists who adopt various viewpoints that are held by other modern rightists without giving them much scrutiny. And one of those issues, I think, is the abortion issue, including and not limited to the value of human life at birth. So, according to the model laid out by ontological propriety, and what I think is truly the right wing view, a person does not have innate value. In fact, I've spoken with many people who are, perennialists on this, and there's kind of a consensus that the value of human life in the eye of God is nil unless it is actualized properly. So you don't have so a person's value doesn't stem from them being born. A person's value stems from them actualizing their correct spiritual dispositions properly. So in regards to the abortion issue, if that's an impossibility, then that's an exception in that regard. I think that the real argument against abortion is the argument against malpractice of, um, you know, I guess you could say social like it disrupts social cohesion because it disrupts um, the binding and purpose of relationships and sexuality and so forth. It's not necessarily based on the value of human life, at least in my opinion.
So, we're dealing with two options. I go back to the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata, and Krishna lays out his reasoning for why he's ordained these events to happen. And he says there's too many people, that the earth cried out to him and said there's too many people. So he's decided to have this war. Um, I think that is a pretty radical solution to overpopulation. It's not one that I prefer. And I think that I have an article called McGenics, and I argue that um,
That's funny.
I have this article, and it was one of my early articles, but I think I could reference it, every week or every month or something. That if you look at individuals, say in the example of relationships, right? We can look at the human being and say that it is optimal for a human, maybe not general. Again, we have like different types or something, but it's optimal for most people to be in this kind of relationship where there's this heterosexual, reproductive, monogamous structure, and this relates to these deeper metaphysical notions of the dyad, and this is how people are meant to be together, and this is a stable structure that makes people satisfied. And if you disrupt that with abortion, birth control, non-reproductive sexuality, you open Pandora's box and all these demons come out, and people end up becoming hysterical. You get some people who are incels who don't have sex at all. You get some people who are hypersexual, people who are addicted to porn. You get all these, weird things happening, and people aren't having children, and people are suffering as a result. And the way I look at that is in the same way that I would look at the Battle of Kurukshetra and say that while this is clearly causing people suffering to be in these chaotic relationships or atypical relationships or whatever. People are clearly, and they'll tell you that, right? You can just ask people who are LGBTQ or childless cat ladies or whatever. You can talk to people and be like, "Are you happy?"
Yeah.
And they
Right.
will they will pretty consistently tell you, no. And then you can say, "Well, why is that?" And they'll give you explanations, and you can either believe their explanation, which has to do with like white heterosexual patriarchy or something, or you can say, well, maybe your behavior is causing your suffering. Um, but I would go a step deeper and I would say it's actually their constitution, that the constitution of these people is ill fitted for reality, that they are actually acting in their own best interest and the interest of everyone else in choosing a non reproductive lifestyle. The people who maybe, and when I say this, oftentimes the response is that, but what about the potential sensitive young man? What about the potential God king, philosopher king, who is born into the world and is groomed by his third grade teacher into believing he's trans, and he cuts off his penis and he becomes a woman? What about that case? Isn't there like this infinite moral hazard that those people are being corrupted and perverted, and we have to protect those people? And my response is like, maybe you don't believe in like divine plans enough.
Right.
Maybe if you believed in sort of more predestination, you would see that I don't know, that these sort of mistakes or the fear of that kind of error being made is perhaps not even just less likely, but metaphysically impossible. So people actualize their destiny due to their karma, and it's actually good that we allow this to take place. This is the appropriate reaction to where we've gotten, which is we have this modern agriculture, which supports, we have modern medicine. And so these things support an unnaturally large population. It actually says this in the Bhagavad Gita in Sanskrit. It says that if you do not follow these laws, it will lead to the proliferation of unwanted populations. So it uses that phrase, which I don't know. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone really fully extrapolate on that or pay attention to that, but it really stuck out to me. And I said, yeah, it seems like to me that leftism, liberalism, feminism, all these quote unquote non traditional things are actually part of kind of a natural cycle and should basically be accepted and embraced. And they're self correcting in the sense that the people who embrace these things, their lines will discontinue. The people who reject them, theoretically, their lines will continue. I have additional ideas about genetic engineering and how kind of these traditional reproductive strategies can be circumvented with technology. But that would be my basic argument for why I think basically when people look at these things as well, I would even make a more meta argument, which is just like the Kali Yuga is good. Like if you believe that God is good, God has ordained the Kali Yuga, then the Kali Yuga is good, and trying to stop that part of the cycle, prevent it from happening, it's actually better to allow it to play itself out and and actually this is what Arjuna does, is Arjuna participates in a mass genocide against his own family, and he's commanded by God to do that. So maybe there's a traditionalist out there who thinks that Vedic scriptures are corrupted and that's like a subversive thing. Maybe there are people who believe that. So I don't know. Maybe that's not good evidence, or we shouldn't rely upon that tradition to tell us what we should do. But yeah, even putting all of that aside, I just think from the Platonist perspective of we're trying to actualize the ideal human form, it doesn't make sense to me to protect people from themselves. So if people are acting in a self-destructive manner, then that's bad. or excuse me, that's good. That's good. I mean, it's bad for them, but it's actually good for the instantiation of a more perfect human form. It's a self-selection process. If
I
you
see what you're
if
saying.
you
Yeah.
bring up the concept of social cohesion, I think this is a legitimate objection. It's one that I deal with a lot of times, and I think it requires a balance. So obviously, if you go up to people on the street and you tell them, um, hey, are you planning to have kids? And they say, not really, that's not for me. And you say, good, because the end of your lineage will mean the perfection of the human form. If you say that to the average person, that's probably not. They'll probably sort of like spitefully try to invert whatever you tell them, and not listen to you. So I don't think that's a really practical strategy. But I think that what we have right now, which is the proliferation of non-traditional structures and ideas, and those who are attracted to them adopt them, and those who are repulsed by them reject them. Um, I think that I call that McGenics, and I don't say that I distinguish that from eugenics in the sense that there are people who would suggest that we whoever we is, the band of 500 men or something, the with Critias as our tyrant, like we should take over the state and we should institute a eugenic reform where we decide who's better and who's worse, and we eliminate the worse and we increase the better. The problem, uh, for my perspective, is that that's a much more destructive to social cohesion than just sort of allowing people to, I don't know, choose their gender or whatever. So I am concerned about that. I am concerned about like nuclear war and chaos and civilizational collapse. And I think we should take that seriously and make sure that doesn't happen, because if that did happen, that would not be a selection for a more perfect form of humanity. That would be, well, in I believe it would select for members of the military who have secret nuclear bunkers underground. Um, but besides that, I don't think that the result would be. Yeah, I mean, I do believe in genetic engineering, so I do believe in science, and I believe in the economic structure that supports it. So I'm interested in maintaining that, and nuclear war would be highly destructive for that. So I think social stability is good, and if there's riots breaking out, we should address that, and we should solve that. But I actually think eunuchs, as a historical phenomenon, tend to increase social stability rather than decreasing it. The problem with eunuchs is potentially you have a society that's so heavily fragile, top down, stratified, that you get a Bronze Age collapse. That so many people are castrated that all it takes is a few pirates to kick in the door and then everything collapses. That's basically what happened to the Hittites and a few other kingdoms during the Bronze Age collapse. I think there's other cases to be made that it happened, in other periods of history, the Romans and so on. So yeah, there's a danger there if you don't maintain a warrior class. Then there's the potential that some pirates could destroy your civilization. So,
Well,
I
you bring up an interesting point, if you don't mind me interrupting.
go ahead.
You bring up very interesting points, but and I would agree with quite a bit of what you just said, by the way. So I don't think that it's too disagreeable in principle, especially in that case made about just allowing the Kali Yuga to kind of play itself out. I do think, however, that at least from an analytical perspective, um, we can draw certain similarities between the transgender phenomenon and the primordial human state. Right? We have the archetypal human state, which is pre-differentiation, pre-gender, even pre-caste. It is the whole and total complete state of the human being. And then there's the notion that from this state, the human was bifurcated into male and female. And the magnum opus of like Hermetic alchemy for example, is the reconstruction of the primordial androgynous state. And I think that that's kind of what drives modern transgender ideology is to reconstruct from a lower and more profane standpoint that initial androgynous human state. So I think there's an esoteric reasoning for all of the developments that we've seen, but what's happened is that the drive to perfect the human state in the spiritual domain has infected, or I guess the lack of belief in a spiritual domain has infected modern the modern zeitgeist with the idea that there is no way to actualize the human state except within the physical domain. So all of these tertiary desires or provisional desires, um, to bring about things like, um, the androgynous state within the actual corporeal human being is the result of a lack of belief and trust in the spiritual domain for that kind of alchemical processing to take place. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I kind of invert your reasoning there. So there's obviously LGBTQ has contradictory elements. It's not a singular phenomenon. It's similar to Pandora's box, right? It's a multitude. It's not a it's there's not one ideal LGBTQ person. You say there it is. That's the platonic form of the LGBTQ,
Right.
because it's differentiated. And so I actually view transgenderism as now there's the non-binary thing, which is a separate phenomenon, but just transgenderism specifically, I view it as a desire to be hyper differentiated. That um, in most cases, it's somebody who, for instance, in the case of a man, suspects that he is not fully masculine, that he is not 100% aligned mind, body, and spirit with masculinity. And so rather than kind of becoming androgynous, he says, well, what is my core true self? Like, what is my spirit? Well, I think my spirit is female. And so, what he's trying to do is he's trying to align his physicality with his spirituality. He's trying to say, I, in my soul, in my mind, in my brain, or whatever, am a female. And so, I want the external physical to reflect that. And so, in fact, transgenderism is an attempt to further differentiate and purify its gender extremism in the sense of taking a gender concept and fully instantiating that gendered concept, as opposed to sort of the ideal of Christ, or the celibate priest who is a monastic, who does not engage in sexuality, who does not have sexual desire, the rishi, who's totally withdrawn from the world, because gender is a social phenomenon. So if you become a pure individual and you're purely separated from society, you lose your gender effectively. If you have no reproductive function, you're totally you're reabsorbing, your semen into your bloodstream, and you totally transcend that material desire. Then you do transcend gender, and that is kind of how one would achieve that pre-gender state. Whereas transgenderism is a post-gender state, saying
I would
I
agree
was one
100%.
gender, now I'm becoming a different gender, but it's reaffirming transgenderism is a social phenomenon. It is a social phenomenon that requires the approval of others, whereas some kind of enlightened, uh, you know,
No, I didn't mean to say as that it was some kind of enlightened state. I think that what you are saying is absolutely correct. It's post differentiation. It's a post differentiation attempt at achieving the pre differentiated state, which is an impossibility. That's why I say
so
it's a profane and lower.
Are you familiar with Rudolf Steiner?
I am a bit.
Okay, so he has this dichotomy between Ahriman and Lucifer, and Ahriman represents the material, Lucifer represents the spiritual. And so I would say that transgenderism is an Ahrimanic approach toward social gender differentiation, whereas the Luciferian approach, despite what popular Satanism says, according to Steiner, if you were really a Luciferian, then you would abandon the material world and you would become a Gnostic, and you would totally, you know, astrally project, and he talks about the astral body and things like that. So yeah, we've clearly gone in this Ahrimanic direction, and I think that is a self-correcting mechanism because simply the quantity of human beings is not sustainable, productive, desirable. It's certainly not conducive to spiritual growth. Having 8 billion, 10 billion people or whatever is not conducive to spiritual growth because what do spiritual masters do? They go in the woods and meditate. How can you go in the woods and meditate if, as Ted Kaczynski discovered, you're in your little log cabin and the loggers come and they start building a parking lot or something, right? So you
Right.
can't do that when we have this overpopulation. And so how do you resolve that? Well, you allow the Ahrimanic to burn itself out. You allow it to take itself to its logical conclusion, which is self-correcting. So people choose to hyperfixate on the social affirmation of their gender, representation, and that's a self-correcting mechanism that prevents them from reproducing. And we see this massive fertility decline, and people are asking, why is this happening? I mean, is it housing prices? Do we need a child stipend? Do we need more, financial support? And I think if you actually look at the data, it has nothing to do with that. And in fact, it can be the reverse. It can be that as people become wealthier, they're less likely to have children. And so that's the Ahrimanic self-correction of a planet which is too burdened with quantity, with mass of human flesh that is groaning and is calling out for reprieve. And the reprieve is coming in the form of people who have checked out of spiritual reality and they are totally plugged into material reality, and they are discontinuing. They are ceasing to participate in this massive population explosion. A naturalistic example would be an algae bloom, where the algae covers the pond and just kills and suffocates everything under it, and then all the fish die, and then it's calm and peaceful again in the pond. When you have too many resources introduced too quickly, like fertilizer, into the pond, you get this algae bloom. Well, human beings, we had too much agriculture, too much medical science introduced too quickly. We had this population explosion. There has to be a healthy self-correction. Otherwise, you get this runaway pollution, you get genetic mutation, you get all these weird things happening. And so I see it as a self-corrective mechanism, and I don't see it as something to oppose. Now, if you feel like what I'm saying is sensible, then I would just make the argument that colloquially representing yourself as a traditionalist, it's your semantic choice to make, no judgment. But for me, I don't feel that it's useful because I end up just having people would just, if I said, well, I'm the real traditionalist, people would be like, no, you're just a
Yeah.
leftist in disguise. And I would be like, okay, well, if the world wants to call me a leftist, then I will adopt the term leftist. If that's what
Well,
you
that's the
want to
thing.
call me, that's what I'll use.
I think that using the definite or using the definitions of the terms provided, we I think you should generally assess where you stand based on your ultimate goal for society, as in, what do you think society should look like? Or what is the metaphysical reasoning for your beliefs? And in the provisional world or the corporeal world, I don't think you can hold the means to the desire of the end, so to speak. So I can actually see your reasoning, but I can tell that you and I kind of desire the same civilizational mode. It's just the methods for getting there, I think, are where we differ. And so, yeah, I could actually see why you would reject that terminological, association. So that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we agree. We agree. I think that I think maybe where if I had to guess, so you can just tell me what your grand plan for society is. I feel that personally, um, there is a balance. I desire more centralization, but at the same time, I recognize, or I feel that directly looking at the human type, um, or how should I say this, assertive negativa. So you could say there's a quad there's four quadrants. There's assertive positiva, which would be to say that thou shalt must reproduce, and then there would be assertive negativa, thou shalt not reproduce, and then there would be kind of passive positiva, which would be you may, if you like, to reproduce, and passive negativa, you may, if you like, not reproduce. So if you're concerned with the human form and you're concerned with generation, then if you're taking the assertive or active approach, then you would say, how do we intervene in this process in order to generate a more perfect human form? And the as opposed to just saying like let people do what they want and see how things shake out. The first approach to me, it seems very fragile, and it seems how do I say this? It seems like too interventionist. It almost seems communist to me, like in the sense of you're attempting to control human evolution from the top down in a direct, ham-fisted way, and I don't view that heavy-handedness as the best strategy. I think that it's better to step back and ask, what is happening right now? What is
Hmm.
happening right now is that there's a massive population reduction. We're learning more about genetics. And so I take those two factors together to say that as a result, the human population is going to decrease, and we're also going to learn how to, directly intervene in a positive way, but doing so, allowing people the freedom, whether they want to apply these technologies or not. That just seems to me to be like if you believe that emergent properties are real, if you believe that markets reflect mathematical proportions, and I guess this do you believe that human beings are particles in a quantum system? That would be sort of my question to people. And if the answer is yes, and if we believe that the universe is governed by laws and that Newtonian properties emerge from these quantum properties, then I suppose that unless like proven otherwise, I mean, if the human population was increasing and our knowledge was decreasing, then I would say, yeah, we should kind of take the bull by the horns and like right the ship. But given the factors as they are, it seems like they're each individual quantum person is making their own decisions, and the Newtonian direction of humanity as a whole is headed in uh, what seems like a positive direction to me. On the individual level, it's negative, but in directionally, it's positive. Um,
There was an article I read about how certain medical technologies are keeping people alive who would otherwise die. And I have it saved and I can send it to you after this so that you could link it or whatever. But I forget exactly what it was called, but it had to do with I think it was called a dysgenic age or something like that, where essentially what is being reproduced now are dysgenic genes in the sense that they're going to have greater reliance on medical technologies, which if they were removed, they would die out. And I think there's something to be said about that because at at a certain level, yeah, we can engineer the human being, but at a different level, it's almost it makes us reliant on the technologies that we create. So I I'm unsure of like for example, eradicating certain diseases technologically or through vaccines or whatever. That's one thing, but making people reliant upon these institutions and these medical advancements, essentially keeping people alive who would otherwise die, and then letting those people reproduce, and then letting those people reproduce and keep reproducing until there's now essentially genes that make up a majority of the gene pool, which are dysgenic in a certain sense. They're sick or predisposed to sickness. What would be your response to that?
I mean, I think you're exploring a really great fundamental principle, which is differentiation versus specialization. Uh, there's a concept of the ideal man as Robinson Crusoe or Adam, which is a man who exists in paradise completely independent of society. And this is what Rishi's spiritual masters attempt to replicate in a monastic life. They retreat into the woods, and it's described, Ramayana or Mahabharata, that you eat simple things, right? You're not eating. Plato describes it as the ideal warrior class should eat a Spartan diet. That you eat no seasoning. You eat like raw meat and maybe some milk and cheese or something. But you keep it very simple. You don't have culinary flourish because that would require you to have a chef, and a chef needs a salary, and the chef needs a kitchen, and the kitchen needs tools, and all of a sudden something so basic as just eating has become extremely complicated. And now, in order to satisfy your appetite, you're reliant on this degenerate artifice. And the spiritual master wants to go back to self-reliance, and wants to get away from society and get away from being dependent on society, because society tells all these lies, and you're seeking the truth, you're seeking God. So there's that ideal Platonic idea of man. But I guess I would say that if you another idea of the perfect man, and man as opposed to lower life forms, is that man is self-aware of his dependence upon God, and that the animal is not aware of its mortality or its contingency. An animal, like a bacteria, right? A bacteria or a cockroach, simpler life forms, you could plop them down on the planet Mars and they might survive. You don't know, these little
Right.
trilobites or whatever. And that's how they're engineered. They're engineered for the general case. They can survive with very little food, water, shelter, heat, whatever. They can survive these harsh environments, and they're generalized toward any environment. It's like if you slap the table and there's bacteria on the table, you won't kill the bacteria because the bacteria is so generalized. Whereas if if you think
Like
about
hit a cat, step on a yeah.
yeah, I
I
mean,
get what
it's
you're
just
saying.
like the more complicated things get, the less resilient they are, the more specialized they are. Um, and if you truly wanted to create the ultimate generalized survivor, sort of independent of the elements, you would end up with something like a cockroach or bacteria. And so the fact that humans are so specialized and dependent should give us some well, if we're self conscious, then we should be humble about that and say that our lives are extremely fragile, and human civilization is extremely fragile, and it could all collapse. And if it did, then none of us would survive, right? Because we're all dependent on modern medicine and vaccines and all of these things. And there's that principled conservative stance that wants to say, no, I want to be self reliant. But I think actually the Platonic state recognizes that each individual organ is absolutely interdependent. You cannot have a philosopher king without a society to rule over. That's different from this Vedic concept of the rishi. He's leaving society. He's trying to abandon society. There's a difference there, but I think the reconciliation is that Plato and the rishi are engaged in the same process over different time periods. That the rishi is attempting to separate from himself from society so that he can discover the truth. And Plato doesn't have time for that because he's engaged in political philosophy. He's trying to address problems on a shorter time scale. So he doesn't have time to go off and completely disconnect from reality or society, but he is still instead he uses this strategy of deconstruction where you continually ask questions of normative statements. So, okay, well, typically we cook our food. Why do we do that? Typically we bury our dead. Why do we do that? We practice monogamy. Why do we do that? And that deconstruction, it's a more aggressive posture than the rishi who goes in the woods, where the rishi's not in direct combative conflict with society. Plato is in conflict. He is confronting societal norms. It's a different approach. Obviously, the Platonic approach is more useful if you're dealing with already existing conditions of rapid dynamic change. If you're dealing with a stable society, then the Platonic deconstruction seems, well, unnecessary and unwarranted. Why would you start poking the bear? Why not just go off in the woods if you really desire spiritual ascension? You know, in the system and society, if society is already working, and that assumes you have a warrior class, a kshatriya, who are the kings, who are ordering everything. You have the vaishya, who are administering the economy. Everything's already working. So the rishi, there's no emergency. But we see throughout Vedic history that rishis are called to instantiate new kingdoms. So the Pandavas are descendants of a rishi who would typically be celibate, but he's summoned in order to start a new divine lineage. And this is the function of the ultimate purpose of the rishi is not simply to go in the woods and contemplate, but it's to separate himself from society, to develop a basically a perfect bloodline so that he can be summoned, so that then he can start a new civilization. Plato was kind of dealing with that dynamic in the middle of things where Athens was conquered by Sparta. There was political chaos. Everything was falling apart. And so he was like, you know, we need a rishi to save us. We need this guy to come out of the woods and save us. And the Greek figure, they don't, because the Greeks are, you know, why exactly this is maybe another discussion, but they have the centaur. And the centaur represents the rishi, essentially. It's a half man, and I believe my internet has just cut out, so I'll have to reconnect to the internet. I didn't realize because I was just going on and on and on. Darn, that was inconvenient. Okay, hello. Yeah. I see there's a note in here. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, sorry about that. Basically, I was just saying that Chiron the centaur is the Greek equivalent of the rishi, and that that the acknowledgement that the ultimate purpose of there is not a strict separation between the material and spiritual, and that they serve a common purpose, and that the full instantiation of spiritual power is material mastery. Of course, you know, if you don't understand that and you think like the spiritual doesn't exist, then, you know, you get into trouble. But yeah, I guess my response would be that in terms of forming the ideal man, that taking control of the political system and trying to instantiate the ideal man from the top down, rather than looking at current trends and seeing them as self-correcting and allowing them to continue, and then operating within that system with that knowledge, which could be called esoteric. It seems to me that that is actually what the rishi does. The rishi looks at society, sees that it's corrupt, escapes from it, but doesn't actually try to democratically go around and red pill people on how you have to change your ways. I mean, that's not what Noah does with the ark. That's not really what Lot does with Sodom. Um, I think sort of. I guess my internet's really conking out. So, uh, I guess I'm gonna have to. I guess I'm going to have to. I'll try to reconnect one last time, and then we'll switch over. We'll switch over here. This is sad because this was working for me. Um, this was working really well for me, and now it's not working.
I can hear you now.
Dang it, man. Yeah, I can hear you too. It's just it's always frustrating when you have connection issues. Anyway, um I have to go, and I'm sorry to end on this note, but I do want, I guess, to give you last word and let us know what you're up to. Let us know what articles you're working on.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's been, I appreciate you having me on. I apologize for the technical issues. I mean, that it is what it is in that regard. I'm just kind of working on a few things. I run a society. I run the Praxius Society, so that's where all of those articles are published on Substack. You can find them there. It's a philosophical association on the basis of that universalism, or perennialism, the universalism to which all philosophical and religious formalisms are reducible. Um, and that's really my main goal is just to acquire that kind of esoteric knowledge, the type of stuff that we've been talking about here, to achieve spiritual actualization and to kind of create the conditions, or at least the knowledge for the.
No way. All right.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you cut off. You said getting the knowledge for the conditions.
Oh, get
I have four
sure that
Wi-Fi
that's
networks. Um, I guess I'm gonna try to reconnect to a different one. I'm kind of hopping back and forth between two Wi-Fi networks here that are apparently giving me problems. I just want to. Maybe I shouldn't have. I shouldn't have done that. My Wi Fi was fine until now. Oh, not delivered. Oh, that's no good. Yeah, I'll try to we should pause this, right? We should pause it. You basically just got to the end of your what you were saying.
okay. That's yeah. I mean, if you have to run, that's fine. I'm not too worried about it. I appreciate you having me on, though.
It worked. It worked the whole time, and then it messed up the conclusion. But yeah, I appreciate you coming on. We should talk again sometime.
Absolutely. I think we're actually in quite a bit of semantic agreements. It's just the difference in methodologies, which even to me is less important. I mean, it's good to know as opposed act like blind firing into the abyss. So, I mean, you certainly have your reasons for why you think certain activities are legitimate and why they're not. And I think that um, I think having the principial. I was actually shocked and impressed at the amount of knowledge you had and your ability to articulate that. So, props to you.
Thank you, sir. We'll talk again sometime. Bye bye.
Absolutely. Bye.
All right. That was a horror show at the end. Disconnected. Oh, just feels terrible to disconnect, man. Let's see. Should I check on my check on my speed test? Let's see what the speed is. What is it like? It cut off the internet on me? It says I got 1,000,000 megabytes per second too. Why am I still recording? Should I stop recording or should I pause it? I'll pause it.